biographical information is on the screen, so you've all read that, and so there's no need for me to repeat it other than to say that it is an honour that Emma is here to open the proceedings with the first talk.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you everyone for being here. I haven't been on a stage for so many years. This makes me think of my Year 10 house plays at my school in Tasmania. So the title that I gave to Philip, I've actually broadened it slightly, although my expertise doesn't go much beyond 1300. I'm going to take us into the later Middle Ages as well. And some of what I talk about here will actually be, if I can get it to change. Oh, hang on, I'll see if I can use the keyboard to get you onto that. Nope, not changing. There we are. There you go. I'll use the keyboard. So what I'm going to talk about today is largely aristocratic marriage, although some of what I talk about will actually be applicable across the social strata as well. But one of the, so I'll be talking about mostly aristocratic, mostly England and the marches. I'll be talking about how marriages were conducted, how they were celebrated, how they were arranged amongst the aristocracy, and how they were provisioned, what sorts of mostly landed interests were set up in preparation for the marriage. Talking a bit about married life, and whether we should believe that medieval marriages were all oppressive and misogynistic and all about wife beating and so forth, and what happens at the end of a union, whether that union has been split up in an untimely manner by people, or whether it's through death. And then, what does one do after one has been married? What do you do next? Right, let's just make, yes, so, okay, I'll use the keyboard. So why am I sticking to elite marriages? Well, the first reason really is because that's my area of specialism. So I can tell you a lot more about the aristocracy than I can about other members of society. They are also, as some of you may well know, much more visible in the records. We can gain a lot more information about aristocratic society, about, amongst the higher ranking men in particular, more biographical information. They also tend to set the trends for society. So what goes on at the top rungs in these sort of political elites and so forth, social elites, then gradually filters down into the lower orders and so forth. So that might be something like use of seals, all sorts of things like that. High stakes were involved in aristocratic marriages, as you'll see. And, so there's an awful lot involved here. And in some ways, I would suggest too that for the aristocracy, you've got even fewer options beyond marriage or a religious sort of life than you might do in other social groups. We don't get, for instance, in the urban business circles, we might get women, independent single women, and so forth. You don't tend to get that amongst the aristocracy. I can't categorically say it never happened, but because so much rests on aristocratic marriage, it isn't very likely to happen. There are a few exceptions. Some individuals swear to take a vow of celibacy or even virginity within marriage, but normally it's just a standard marriage. Now, in the aristocracy in particular, they are not something you're supposed to do yourself. You don't get to choose. You don't get to have a boyfriend or a girlfriend and then say, let's get married. It is something that your guardian, usually your father, the lord and father, your brother if he's taken over the estates, the king if he's your guardian, whoever is your legal guardian. And this goes for both young men and young women, it's not just for women. Neither partner has much say, if any. And the marriage itself is merely one facet, in fact probably the kind of focal point of a much wider business arrangement, which is why obviously you don't get to choose, it's your guardian. Now, having said that, there are two legitimate ways of getting married in the Middle Ages, and they kind of operate in tension with each other and of course in tension with the interests of your family. So the first one I call self-marriage. That's not a contemporary term, that's just something I've called it, where you marry yourself. And it is very easy to do. It is quite foreign to us, actually, in the 21st century. It simply involves words of consent, words of present consent, basically saying I do. And you can do this anywhere. You can do this at the pub, you could do it behind the bike shed, you can do it in bed, when you're having sex, kind of thing, you can do, which is obviously, going to lead to some unfortunate outcomes, or, mind changes, and so forth. Or you can say that I consent to marrying you in at some future time, but then you go and have sexual intercourse, which then turns that into a legitimate marriage. Now, you don't need permission for this to happen. There are no witnesses. No priest needs to be present. Sometimes there's a private exchange of tokens, rings fashioned out of reeds, whatever you've got to hand. And the church actually kind of accepts and presides over this situation, because the ultimate foundation really of marriage in the Middle Ages is consent. And the church is concerned enough about people then saying, oh no, I'm not really married to you, I didn't mean to say that, or whatever, all these sort of confusions and disagreements, that it declares marriage a sacrament in the 12th century and tries to bring it in-house a bit more. Now the problem with marrying yourself, getting married off your own bat, is that your family may be very, very upset about it. Which is highly likely if you're from the aristocracy or the gentry or something like that. And we have a pretty well-known case from the mid-15th century amongst the Paston letters, where Marjorie Paston gets married to the family bailiff, who is probably a lovely guy, but well beneath her station. And the letters all show her mother's distress and all sorts of things. So it's problematic to do it that way. And like I mentioned, it can be confused. It can lead to confusion, denial, disagreement. I am married. I'm not married. All of that kind of thing, and can also cause problems. There's been some high-profile cases of the aristocracy where it turned out that one of the couples had long ago as a child been betrothed to someone else, and technically that was the valid union and not the one that they were in. So despite the birth of children, etc., the marriage has to be annulled. So it seems kind of enlightened. On the other hand, it leads to all sorts of problems. Now, the other way to do it is the church marriage, what one might call a church marriage. It is what we recognise today, one of the things that one can do today. It doesn't take place inside the church. You don't walk down the aisle of the central nave. You do it outside the church at the porch, at the church door and the porch of the church, and you can see these. I do have a colleague who doesn't really think it took place, who disagrees, but I think there's enough contemporary illustration to show them literally, it's not a figurative term, they are literally at the church door for the marriage. And that does have witnesses. You would normally have people standing to hear the spoken words and so forth. You will have a priest. It can involve, again, the exchange of tokens, but this is done in front of people. Often too, you'll have in the elite circles, it might be the point at which, and I'll explain dower a bit more in a second, the point at which the church door or the nominated dower is declared by the husband, the land that the wife, should she be widowed, will hold for life to support her on his death, and that will be done in front of witnesses too. Maybe the tokens might include a charter that encapsulates that. As we get to the 13th century, the written word becomes much more important. But it's not entirely clear. And often what's the case is the couple might already be married, but they're kind of setting the seal on it, they're solidifying it, whatever, before the church door. So those are legitimate forms of marriage. But unfortunately, if you're aristocratic, you don't really get to do it. You can't just marry yourself. I mean, Marjorie Paston did. She's a gentry woman, she did it. It didn't go down well. You don't really get. And often also, as I say, one of the points that I have down there is that you're very young usually when the marriage is sorted out. It can be arranged even earlier and then conducted when you're 12, 14, that kind of age. And that's the interesting thing is, and I compare with peasant marriages. There's enough evidence now to suggest that peasants didn't marry. That it was quite normal for a peasant woman, for instance, to marry only at the age of about 25, which is quite, normal today. an aristocrat would have 10 children by then. They might not all still be alive, but you know, that you'd be 10 years married by then, kind of thing. Yeah, it's part of so the choice of your first, I put in brackets first spouse, because that's where it really matters. You're young, you're underage, you're in the wardship, you're under the control, the legal guardianship of your father, or your legal guardian might be the overlord, or someone like that, the king, if you're high enough ranking. You're underage. Full legal age is thought to be about 21. It's particularly an issue when you're young. Your parents or legal guardian or whoever choose the partner, it's part of a deal hammered out with the other partner's parents or legal guardians, with maybe the king involved. There's pressures and expectations always being brought to bear. They're social, they're familial, they're seigneurial, they're sort of to do with the overlords, or they're royal. They might, in the work that I do on the frontier, geographical considerations come into it. Militaristic considerations, all of these things come into play in the deals being hammered out for young marrying aristocrats. And you can't arrange a marriage if you're overlords or the king if you're tenants-in-chief unless they are happy to do it. But they don't want to see alliances between their enemies, for instance. And yet, as we'll see, protections are in fact kind of entered into the deal, protections for both partners and their families, their family estates and so forth. It's not just, you know, anything goes and hopefully it all works out. There are always some clauses and sub-clauses that make, you know, contingency plans and so forth. Things don't go to plan. And then we sometimes can find these arrangements enshrined in documentation, either a charter or some other legal document registered at Westminster after the event, as one I'm about to discuss, after the marriage has taken place, but registering the deal. And again, 13th century is where you start to get more detailed. You get something that might be termed a contract that still exists, rather than just a reference in some other charter to a portion of land given with marriage or something like that. You get actual contracts. So this is where I'm going to tell you a little bit about the what normally comes into an aristocratic marriage deal, the landed society. So land is wealth. Land is, you know, everything, your status, your street cred, your wealth, all of it depends on how much land you've got, rather than having big bank accounts and offshore accounts and so forth. So the maritagium is the name used in England after the Norman conquest for the marriage portion of the woman, and it's a marriage portion in land. It helps for us because we don't have to use the word dowry, which is what it is. It's a form of dowry. We don't have to use that word, which often can be confused with dower, which belongs to the widow. And in Latin, confusingly enough, the same word, dos, is used for both. But in English, in England, English history, and March history and so forth, we can use the word maritagium for the girls, the woman's portion. It comes from the estates of her family or her guardian's estates or something like that. Occasionally I've got a charter, I've worked with a charter from 1100 where the king, probably William Rufus, it says King William, had granted the land in question. Some of it comes from the marriage portion of one of the women mentioned, and it was granted to her or in readiness for her marriage, or it was granted with her to her husband by King William. Now it's probably Rufus, but it's not entirely clear. It's usually, as in that case, traditionally the maritagium is bestowed on the young man with the girl, with the woman, cum filia, with the daughter, provided if we're talking about the father. So that's the kind of, it gradually as time wears on, there are all sorts of additional stipulations as who it can descend to and so forth. But the traditional is basically a portion of land that goes to the young groom with the bride and descends to their offspring. It's kind of her pre-mortem inheritance. It helps support the family and so forth. It'll either go to her descendants, to the descendants of the couple usually. It will go to the children as an inheritance, unless there are no children. If no children survive to inherit this maritagium, for up to the third generation it will return to the donor's estates. So this is an expectation, and gradually it becomes enshrined in law as common law crystallises. For 3 generations, it's still liable to revert to the family, the holdings of the donor, because he'll be dead by now. If after that period the marrying couple's line fails, it's fine, it stays there. But so there are protections. The land either descends with the marrying couple's children or it goes back to the original pot. It's meant to be free of any kind of service obligations, all sorts of services that usually involved with land. Frank marriage is the term that you will often come across, free marriage. No, it means it's free of obligations, most obligations, certainly obligations to an overlord. The interesting thing is that in the March, I found marriage portion, maritagia, which in fact reserve the military obligation, which is I think very, very interesting, that although it is a maritagium, it says free of services except whatever the military requirement is attached to those lands. And I think that's very telling that we're dealing with the militarised frontier. Now, it remains with, as I mentioned, it remains with her in widowhood, and then either descends to her offspring or reverts after her death, depending on what the situation is with her children. Now, increasingly, in the 13th century, and there's a marriage agreement I'm going to show you in a second, a Mortimer one, cash portions start to come in, and they become more popular, particularly away from the frontier. In lowland England, cash portions become the norm. By the mid-14th century, a cash portion for the bride is the norm, and it's usually about buying a suitable husband for the bride, paid by the bride's father to the groom's father. So this starts to take over. The widow's portion is the dower. We get 2 kinds of dower. Early on, it is this in particular, in the sort of Anglo-Norman period, you're looking at something called dos nominata, or nominated, or also known as church door dower, which is what I mentioned in the ceremony, is often something that is announced at the church door. It is the dower that the husband has predetermined is going to support her if he dies first. And it can be as much as 1/3 of his land, but it can't be more, and it has to be a suitable portion to sustain her and the family. And it's sometimes, if he's just a young boy, it's often come from the father and so forth. It's arranged by the father or something like that. That gradually becomes, it begins to be replaced by something called the reasonable third, which is a third, an automatic third of the late husband's land, that is doled out by administrative process after the husband has died. It's not announced at the church door, it's just part of how the estates are administered afterwards, and 1/3 goes to the wife. So you can see that, given that dos nominata allows less than 1/3, why gradually it goes out of fashion, and people just opt for the automatic third. But the way in which that third is determined actually shifts. So it changes from the day at which he's met the 1/3 of his land on the day he's married, to 1/3 of the land on the day he dies, to 1/3 of the land he's ever held, which means a lot of litigation to get back stuff that's been given away during the marriage. But yeah, the determinant of the third shifts, because it factors in that he could lose all his lands, or he could. So if he's come to the marriage very, very wealthy and then managed to squander his lands, and the widow then gets very little in widowhood. If he starts off a relatively poor man and then he's really wealthy, and it's at the wrong end of the marriage, all sorts of things like that. So the way in which that third is determined shifts. But gradually we get something coming into fashion which kind of supersedes dower, called jointure. Now, jointure is interesting because actually it can be done at the time of marriage, settled by the father or the groom or whatever, on both couple at once, or it'd be by the father or something like that, on both partners at once, so it's an equal right to the land, and the surviving partner then holds that land. It can actually be done during the marriage. It can be the wife's land. So we have a case in Wem, in Shropshire, in the 13th century, where the wife has lots of land. She's remarried at aged about 50, and they install her entire inheritance, she's inherited the estates, in the hands of a trustee, a third party, and then resettled on husband and wife together. So in a sense, it creates a kind of large, a bit like dower for the husband as well. And it can function as a marriage portion and or as the dower. So gradually these arrangements change. And for the husband, aside from where he can have jointure, we see something called courtesy of England. Now this is his right to hold his wife's land for life, provided in the manner of dower, except there's one stipulation. There has to have been a child born of the marriage. It has to have taken a breath, even if it dies immediately. It has to have been born alive. There may be no children living by the end of the marriage. If there has been a child born living, then he gets to hold her lands, if she's an heiress or something, until his own death, in the manner of dower. So the husband is not without his interests as well. Why is that not going to change now? Let me try something here. There we are. So we have here a particular case, one case of one of the women I worked on. I worked on mother and daughter. So Isabel, who was the daughter of Roger Mortimer, who died in 1282, and his wife Maud Browse. And Isabel has married John III Fitzalan, if you can call him that, the heir apparent to Clun and Oswestry. He's also he has an expectation of becoming Earl of Arundel, but it's still in the hands of the old Dowager Duchess of Arundel and Dowager Countess of Arundel, sorry, and he dies before it comes to it. But he has that right in the wing, but he is the heir. He's going to become the Baron of Clun and Oswestry. He's not yet 14, they're already married, and this is the contract that's then registered at Westminster. And here are the different things that are put towards it. The groom's father is giving 100 marcates of land, so it's land generating 100 marks a year. It's in Oxfordshire, it's for the couple's use, so it's probably something like church door dower. Although I know from the records that Isabel gets her reasonable third at the end, but this is probably something along the lines of church door dower. The maritagium, the classic maritagium, is given by the bride's father, and that's land worth £40 a year of domain land, which means that that's land that they exploit themselves. It's not sub-infeudated, in other words, not bestowed on a vassal. They don't have tenants or vassals in that land. That's land that they have their mills and their farmers and all of that on. It's to be held in frank marriage. This is a term, free of obligation. That's the term I refer to. By the husband and his heirs, by Isabel, under the barons of Wigmore forever. So in terms of that land, even 5 generations, 6 generations later, their overlords on that land will be the barons of Wigmore. The bride's father also gives some cash. It's not clear who receives that cash, though. It's not clear whether that will go to the couple or if it's a cash portion paid to the groom's father, which it may well be. Now, there are built-in protections. Isabel will retain the land, both lots of land, Oxfordshire and Shropshire, for life if she's widowed, or indeed if she's repudiated. So the contract actually acknowledges that it's possible that she'll be repudiated. I mean, she isn't, it doesn't happen. But it builds in this kind of protection in case the boy grows up, reaches 21 and goes, I did not consent. Now, if the couple die without children, the lands will go back to their respective donors, the grantors, the maritagium will, and then the Fitzalan land, the sort of dower land, will stay with Isabel until she herself dies, if she's the second one to die. Now, there's also a get-out clause, at least for the groom, that says that if on reaching, full age or whatever, he wishes to leave the marriage, end the marriage, Isabel will still be able to retain those landed interests. She won't suddenly find herself out in the cold. She'll be protected. So that's all written into it. And this would probably have taken quite some time to hammer out, negotiate, and whatever at some point, and then the marriage is conducted, and then this is registered. So there's a legal record in the National Archives now. Now, the stereotypical image. So that's all great. Now, the aristocratic marriage, or any marriage at all in the Middle Ages, the stereotypical image is of wife-beating, misogyny, violence, oppressive for women, loveless, a lonely kind of place to be, an awful place. So 2 of those images up there show wife-beating. In fact, the little round plate shows husband-beating by a wife wearing a horned headdress. So, the misericords and things like that, topsy-turvy imagery, medieval imagery, shows wives with rolling pins and frying pans and paddle of some description or whatever, I'm not sure what she's got in hand, beating their husbands and so forth. Now, there are plenty of scholars who take this line, misogynistic and oppressive women without rights and so forth. Georges Duby is one of them, Judith Bennett, There is contemporary evidence of wife beating, of course, because it goes on in any society. So imagery, we've got court records, we've got sermons telling, admonishing husbands to behave properly. We've got Welsh law. Welsh law regulates, Cyfraith Howell regulates when it is appropriate for the husband to beat his wife, and how thick the rod he uses should be, and whereabouts he should hit her on the body, i.e. not the head, anywhere but the head. So regulating husbandly violence. Literature will talk about violence and brutality. And it is true in law, but it isn't acceptable. It's still no more acceptable in the Middle Ages than it is today, really. I mean, Welsh law regulates it, so, but a wife also has, a common law, a wife has no separate legal identity. So any land, she can be the greatest heiress in the land, and the moment she marries, during the course of that marriage, as long as the husband lives, he controls that land. He is the one who goes to court. I mean, he has to attend court with her together. His name's on documents. It's essentially, he takes the title of Earl or whatever, if there's, or a Baron of Wigmore or whatever it is. I mean, that was the Mortimer's own, but it's all about him. And so, yeah, that's the downside. On the other hand, there's plenty of evidence to suggest that it isn't like that in a lot of marriages. Even arranged marriages can develop, can become effective relationships, partnerships, love, any of that. Sometimes arranged marriages work, sometimes they don't. And we have evidence of marriages, of the positive side. So for one thing, in terms of law, the husband actually theoretically needs his wife's consent to dispose of her land, so he can't ride roughshod over her wishes. I mean, how he obtains that consent is, of course, anyone's guess. But and she can go to court and say, I didn't consent to that, but as a femme couverte, a woman who was covered, or a woman under the husband's control, I wasn't able to stop him. I said I didn't want to, and we have stories of women agreeing whilst crying and things like that to have their land alienated or whatever. They can actually theoretically they can go to court and say no, I want it back, and get it back. So, and we have cases like there's a proof of age clause in an Inquisition post-mortem. Now, this is a document where a sort of governmental document that it works out where all the lands, every time a tenant-in-chief dies, who's the next heir of that land? We need to make sure they get it and all that. And in order to prove that the heir is of the legal age, old enough to get his land and not be put in wardship for the time being, they have a proof of age clause where they go out and they ask people, how can we know this is when this child was born, or when this heir was born? So you'll have people saying, oh, I remember because I was at a party at that time and news arrived that this child had been born and things like that. We have some interesting cases from the March, actually. Fulk Fitzwarren, in real life, one of the Fulk Fitzwarrens was hosting a party and their wife wasn't there because she was heavily pregnant, and then the witness says, I was there and I remember the birth because the messenger arrived, said the wife had given birth and the child was a boy, and everyone heartily congratulated the father because thus far all his children had been girls. He kept just having girls, and at last a little boy was born. So there'll be things like that. And there's a case here where a guy called William Quinton recalls the birth of the heir in question because it coincided, it happened on the day that he was burying his wife and he was beside himself with grief. Now, it is possible that this wasn't an arranged marriage. It might have been a later one where they did it themselves. But marriages can also have, in the Middle Ages, were also a positive experience for some people, just as they were, for others they weren't. And one of the things that comes out a lot in my research is the working partnership between noble couples. We don't have love letters necessarily, as we do, say, through the Pastons later on, but we can see really productive partnerships. So some of the Marcher partnerships that I've looked at are the marriage of Matilda de St. Valery and William de Breaux's, who died in 1211 and 10 respectively, pursued by King John. They were the ones who fell out with King John. Roger and Maud Mortimer of Wigmore, I'm going to discuss them in a minute. Griffith ap Gwenwyn of Southern Powys and how he's the Strange of Knockin, who's a Marcher woman. Lots of evidence of them engaged together in estate management, politicking, political machinations, spying, working together on behalf of the crown against Llewellyn ap Griffith or something like that. Religious benefaction, that's a big deal. Charity, doing it together. Litigating together in the courts, and they'll have parallel roles. Sometimes they're working apart on the same project, sometimes they're together in court, or they've sent a single attorney for both of them to court. Now, the Mortimers of Wigmore are an excellent case in point because we see, I've written in a few places about this, we see them jointly litigating in the King's Court in pursuit of estates, usually lords, that's why they're together, acting jointly against Simon de Montfort and Llewellyn ap Griffith. So Maud, in the case at least we know of Llewellyn ap Griffith, is kind of acting as a spy, channeling intelligence from people working for them and the crown as to the whereabouts and movements of the Welsh prince. It's likely she's doing something very similar with Simon de Montfort. She may also have been attacked by him and his sons on one occasion. And at the same time she's doing that, she's manning the castles on the frontier. She's at Clun, and so forth. Clun doesn't belong to the Mortimers, but at this point it's in their hands as a wardship thing. She's at Clun, she's at Wigmore, she's at places like that while Roger is in the field. And so really the idea of an aristocratic woman sitting in a arched, high Gothic window in the Great Hall doing needlework all the time, I'm not sure that she had very much time for doing that kind of thing. And in fact, so successful is the partnership between Maud and Roger, I mean, everything shows that it works really, really well. And she's actually, interestingly, significantly older than he is. I say significantly, he was 17 or 18 when they were married, she was something like 24, which is unusual. But it's worked so well that, in fact, when, now it's not going to want to change it, when they worked against Simon de Montfort, I don't know why this is, there we are, as a token of his appreciation for her efforts against Simon, Roger, who we believe killed Simon himself, or probably did it, was certainly there, collected the head and perhaps also the testicles, draped over the head, the nose, and sent them to Maud at Wigmore Castle where she was waiting. And so she received this gift to say, oh darling, you shouldn't have. I've always wanted one of these, yeah. But he said, and that's clearly to say, look, he's dead, our enemy is dead, and the prize pickings are going to be the head in particular. So, yeah, we know that happened. Now, just to wrap up, if I can get it to change, if a marriage doesn't work out, and it didn't always, there's no such thing. You can end it. There are ways to end it, but it's not divorce as we know it. You're not breaking up a legal, legitimate marriage. You have only annulment on the grounds that the marriage isn't legal. Something is wrong with that marriage. So you have to get proof or agreement from the Pope or someone like that, Archbishop of Canterbury, and then the Pope can intervene to say, this marriage isn't legit. So even if you've had children, you've been together for years, you can part. It's usually to do with consanguinity, your relationship to your partner. The problem is that the degrees in which you're not allowed to be related to someone are so broad that by modern standards, there's no genetic issue, there's no sort of medical issue, there's nothing, it's so far, but canonically, religiously, whatever, it's too close. So you can suddenly remember, now that you don't like each other very much, that actually we're too closely related, and then you part. Didn't consent. We have a few cases of aristocratic couples saying, well, we didn't consent. Non-consummation, male impotence, things like that are grounds for splitting up. Political considerations couched as something else, saying, oh, well, we're too closely related, whatever, or political interference from the king or someone else kind of getting involved and trying to split you up. There are high cases of high-profile splits amongst royalty and aristocracy right throughout the Middle Ages. We know King John sets aside his first wife, the Countess of Gloucester, keeps her lands, but puts her aside and marries Isabella d'Angoulême, and so forth. And we have a case from the Shropshire archives that I discovered when I was doing my PhD, of a woman who made a grant of land to Holmond Abbey after having celebrated her divorce from Adam. So the divorce, the Latin word divorcium is used, but it doesn't, we understand it differently. It's an annulment, what we would call an annulment. And celebration is probably not a party. It's probably marking the occasion with a religious donation. It's not she had a party. But yeah, which is very interesting. So she and her husband have split up. Now, and the very last thing I want to say was, so if you have got to the end of your marriage, one of you's died, there are options. Widows, one of the things about widows is that under common law, so aristocratic widows, have full legal capacity, provided they're of age, provided they've passed 21, they have full legal capacity. That means that they are effectively operating on the same level as a man, as a male lord. They are a lord. There's a couple of, they can't fight and they can't hold public office, although occasionally we see female sheriffs, but generally speaking, they can't do those things. But in terms of estate management, litigation, they go there on, all of it, they are the same as a man. And we have some pretty long-lived, powerful dowagers in the Middle Ages who choose not to remarry and aren't forced into it, thanks to Magna Carta, and who, like the Dowager Countess of Arundel, who keeps most of those estates for a long time. She's a very old lady when she dies. You can remarry. If you're underage, the same considerations before. Guardians, parents, whatever, get involved and sorted out. You go straight back into protection of your guardian if you're underage. You can purchase, make sure you hold your own rights, particularly with women. You can make sure that you have purchased your rights to your own marriage, which means that you can choose, provided it's someone acceptable to the king, to your overlord, whatever. Those constraints still exist. There's no, I can't marry the maid servant or whatever, the stable boy. You have control of your own marriage. And Magna Carta basically enabled women to purchase their own marriages at a reasonable price and so forth, and stop the depredations of the Angevin rulers, Henry, Richard and John, who would sell off heiresses at the highest bidder or to their favourites, do all sorts of terrible things, bankrupt, say, well sure, you can stay single, but it'll cost you pretty much everything you've got. That stopped. Another option is, and we do actually have, so Isabel Mortimer is actually single for 13 years before presumably she meets someone and gets remarried after the death of FitzAlan. Gets remarried, and the king initially, Edward I, orders her land seized because she's got married without permission, and then he finds, oh no, Roger, her father, actually bought the rights to her land and gave them to her, and she had every right to do it, and the husband's fine, she can marry him. So that was sorted out. So there is not people who do, people sometimes marry many times in quick succession, or they are single for a long time, but maybe they met someone, whatever. Or you can enter a religious life. And we have we have some interesting cases in the marches of marcher noblewomen becoming anchoresses, entering these enclosed life attached to, that's what this is in Illustrated, it's an anchoress in an enclosure attached to the wall of a church, and that's a church in Iffley, outside Oxford, in Oxfordshire. And Anna de Breaux's, once widowed from Hugh de Mortimer in the early 13th century, he was killed at a tournament, and she becomes a widow, and she goes and becomes an anchoress for the rest of her life in Iffley, attached to Iffley Church. Her cell is, I believe, still there, still visible. Her sister, Countess of Leicester, in widowhood, does exactly the same thing in, I think, Cambridgeshire or somewhere like that. Or another.
These aristocratic marriages seem highly complex, and you mentioned something about being registered in Westminster. Were they all registered centrally, or were the justiciars separate in different manners or whatever?
Yeah, I think a lot of them were. There's a lot. I mean, the central records that now are in the National Archives contain a lot of sort of high-ranking marriage documents where. And it's a class of document known as the Feat of Fines, and it's one portion of a tripartite deed which contains the agreement. And they're used for all sorts of things. They're used for Jewish money lending and things like that. That's that type of deed. And it's the same thing written out 3 times on a piece of parchment and then cut 3 ways. The idea it's an anti-forgery device. It's only legit if they all fit together. And the foot goes to the central records, and then the 2 parties keep another piece. And I think we've got one document somewhere where we've got all 3 pieces, but mostly that doesn't. The central piece will survive by and large, but the private versions won't. Yeah, and I think they are very complicated, and particularly as more and more options about how to arrange things come into play, the written word becomes increasingly important. You know, documentation, much more of a reliance in a way that, I mean, it's not strictly the way that everything is written down for us in a contract, but it's moving that way from sort of the Norman period where things are much more visual and done as a sort of, so religious benefaction or whatever is done as a kind of a public event at the altar, and so they're all the witness, all you who witness it will be there to remember it and know that it happened. And the charters are part of that, but they're not the be-all and end-all, whereas for us, the contract is. So we're moving that way in the 13th century. So it's at this period that sort of Roger Mortimer's family start to get. So Isabel's sister, Margaret, there's also she doesn't marry into the Marches, she's off somewhere else. But there's also a contract for her marriage as well, or what we call a contract. That's a term I'm using lightly, but there's a fine. But yeah, I think at this level, yes, absolutely, because the king is the overlord of most of these territories. They're tenants in chief, so for most of it, he's going to want to know who's marrying whom, which of my marcher lords, marrying each other and stuff. So yeah, makes it useful for us, as historians.
John de Warren was trying to get a divorce from Joan de Var, and actually went to Rome and had his marriage annulled, but the king and his son wouldn't agree to it. So,
yeah.
how is it that he couldn't marry anybody else because he was still?
Yeah, you're between a rock and a hard place, and I guess it's a matter of probably, the matter of whoever blinks first or backs down first. No, you get situated, or the opposite, where the Pope says the marriage is not valid, and the couple's like, it is, or those around, yeah. And I think unless something gives, he is stuck, or they are stuck, they can't remarry, they're going to have to lead separate, legally married lives, but they can't stand each other or whatever and just do their own thing. Yeah, no, you do get that. Or you get, there was one case, I can't remember who it related to, but the Archbishop of Canterbury said, you're too closely related. And the Pope said, don't worry about it, I'll give you a dispensation, because you can get papal dispensation. So you're very distantly related, and the law of the church would say you can't marry, but the Pope just grants a dispensation. Just, yes, it's fine. I've said that God says it's okay. So, yeah.
And if I remember correctly, in John de Warren's case, it was because he wanted to marry his mistress.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
You're just going to have to keep a mistress, and.
But interesting that he wanted to marry for love.
Yes. Yeah, and he couldn't because of all the other expectations and pressures.
Okay, Anthony.
2 questions, if I can get away with it, please. First of all, a very technical question around the formation of a marriage. When you referred to consent, self-marriage, consent of the parties, did that have to be expressly consent to marriage, or just consent to intercourse? This is a big difference when it comes on to Edward IV.
Yes. Gosh, I don't. Well, it.
And the other question, so you can decide how to answer it.
Okay.
Is, and I take it you've been describing Norman oblique common law oblique English law. Does traditional Welsh law, as in the laws of our differ in any significant way around the formation of marriage?
Okay, so I'll answer the first question first. In terms of consent, well, it's a tricky one, because if you're consenting to marriage, you're essentially consenting to sexual intercourse anyway, because a legal marriage is only made with sexual intercourse. So, technically, so one of the ways to consenting to marry someone at a future time, but then sleeping with them actually makes you legally married. So, and it's different because consent to marry is also not linked with free choice. So, in terms of an aristocratic person, you're going to say, yes, okay, I consent. You've grown up with the expectation that your parents arrange your marriage for you. And unless you have some, like Lady Jane Grey, Helena Bonham Carter, absolute objection so that the parents whip you or whatever, you're likely to say, yes, I consent, and that's just part of the formalities. So I'm not, it is technical, and I couldn't answer that with any thorough knowledge. In terms of Haldar, there's a lot, I mean, we don't actually know quite, there was a lot of questions over classical Welsh law and how much it was ever used as it is written in the texts, how old some of it is, some of it's very old, some of it is clearly dates from the period in which the manuscripts were written down that we have today, 13th to 15th century. Now, in terms of formation of marriage, I can't remember, I'm not a specialist in Welsh law, I can't remember how the marriage is formed, but it's a very different setup. Women have no property rights in classical Welsh law. Now, we see in practice, things are very different, but in the Cyfraith Howell, as it survives in our texts, for the most part, women don't. We see some change in some of the later manuscripts. They have chattels, they have pots and pans and cows and whatever, even the wealthy women. It's a very, very different setup. Women are not involved in the transmission of land in classical Welsh law. There are all sorts of safeguards and stipulations about what the woman gets if the marriage breaks up before 7 years, after 7 years, why she might be allowed to divorce her husband. Now, I believe in Welsh law, there is real divorce. Now, a specialist might be able to correct me, but my understanding is that Welsh law has divorce as we understand it, the breaking up of a legitimate marriage. And that can be of several reasons. One of them impotence, one of them fetid breath, things like that. Which sounds hilarious. Some of it's written in burlesque terms, but the serious meaning behind it is if you're very unwell with some kind of disease like, advanced diabetes, unregulated diabetes, you're likely to have erectile dysfunction. You may well have bad breath. You'll have issues that all stop you from procreating and things like that. So, yeah, and there are reasons why the wife, she can, if her husband cheats on her, she has to put up with it until the third occasion, and then not only is she allowed to divorce him, but she really must divorce him. Otherwise, she has to bite her tongue. She can't complain about him cheating on her if she's let him do it more than 3 times. So there are all sorts of reasons why. And if he beats her inappropriately, beats her too much, it's really very interesting. But what I see going on at the higher levels in the 13th century, late 12th century, is rather, and I've written an article about it, is rather more like what's happening in England, is a kind of melding of Welsh law and common law to set women up in the Welsh elite society on a par with other European nations, because land is wealth, land is power, and the princes of Wales, they are crowned heads of Europe. That's how they see themselves. They don't see themselves as part of some backwater. They want to compete on the international stage. Land needs to circulate in a similar manner to it does in sort of broader Western Europe and so forth. Sorry, I went on a bit there. But
thank you very much. A fascinating answer. The implication from your answer about consent is that provided neither father nor biological father nor mother are married to somebody else, there can be no such thing as bastardy. Acts of rape.
Yeah. You need to, maybe, yes. So whether William, because William the Conqueror's dad was married. Yeah, if they're married to someone else, then you're a bastard. But if they're actually, technically you're married. If you're not married to someone, you're right. I hadn't thought of that.
Which has an interesting interplay with the de Montfort case, where he marries Eleanor of England, and the king is driven to allege rape, because otherwise he's stuck with it on consent.
Yeah. It's a minefield.
Any other questions? We've got time for perhaps one more.
Kind of following on from what you were saying about Welsh law and adultery, what happened in England if either the husband or wife was found to have committed adultery? Were there any comebacks? That's a good question, actually. I haven't thought much about adultery in England, which is odd. It must happen all the time, right? So, these unhappy aristocratic marriages and things like that, and the mistresses, and John of Gaunt marries eventually a woman who's been his mistress right throughout his other marriages. And I think by and large, one tends to turn a blind eye if it's a political arrangement, or John of Gaunt couldn't marry Catherine Swynford because she was beneath him. He was married to the European princesses and things like that. His second marriage was a Spanish woman. But I don't actually know
what the legal consequences are, if anything, and whether you can do anything about it. I certainly know the Welsh law sets it out very carefully. The thing that comes out of Cyfraith Howell is that the key priority is the smooth functioning of society. So what Cyfraith Howell actually does is prefer the continuation of a successful union than breaking it up. So there's scope for reconciliation. There's also a rather burlesque depiction of if a husband and wife split up, the husband leaves his wife and she goes off to marry someone else. He can reclaim his first wife before she marries as she's marrying the second guy. If the second man, the new husband, has 1 foot in the bed, and 1 foot, so they're about to consummate the union, he has 1 foot in the bed and 1 foot out. The first husband can come and say, I've changed my mind, I want you back. And basically it sounds funny, it's the last possible moment before the second union becomes valid. He's just about to have sex, but he's still got 1 foot out. And the first husband can claim the wife back. And it seems to me, and people I've spoken to, point towards a preference for unions staying together, the smooth functioning of society and things like that, because it is a compensation culture. It's not a criminal, there's no criminal justice system, it's compensation, it's carefully ordering the smooth running of society. It's just that sometimes when you read the text you think, what on earth is this supposed to mean? But if you think about it, it's quite sensible. But I don't know if I answered your question, but yeah, I don't know much about adultery in England. I should look into that actually. I'm too interested in functional partnerships.
Okay. If I can just ask you one question.
Oh yeah.
Towards the end you were referring to talking about annulments.
Yes.
Are there many examples of the woman in the marriage seeking an annulment?
I don't know. I mean, there probably are. The records that I've seen, and none of the annulments that I've seen tend to be after the period that I'm currently interested in, so after 1300, so current affairs to me. And therefore I've not looked at them closely. But the things that I vaguely remember glancing over and knowing about are simply saying their marriage was annulled. They had children, they went their separate ways. But not who initiated it. Sometimes you know who initiated. You know King John, he's doing that. But I'm sure there are. And I'm sure there are on the grounds, or there would be, because impotence is one of the reasons why you can say the marriage really isn't working. And you had these, what we call them, a panel of women, horrendous, absolutely horrendous. Of course the man would be impotent. A panel of women examining the man naked to see if he can get an erection. There's no way he could. But in order to justify, and that's a legal procedure, in order to justify, or to support what the woman's saying and say, yeah, this marriage isn't going to work. So yeah, there must be women-driven annulments, but that's not necessarily at the level of the high political elite, so we don't know what's going on there.
Sorry.
No, I was going to say, there is a really great example.
Sorry, you just wait a second, Chloe.
Sorry. There is a really great example from the decidedly modern 14th century.
Yeah, sorry.
I know.
Current.
I'm actually going to mention her in my talk.
Oh, good. There we are.
Joan Kent,
Yeah.
who was the mother of a king,
Yeah.
and she alleges to enter into a kind of clandestine self-marriage when she's 12 with Thomas Holland, and then a few years later her family arrange a much more appropriate marriage, and when she decides that actually she's kind of sick of being the Countess of Salisbury, she does actually petition, and it goes all the way to the papacy,
Okay,
and
brilliant.
eventually manages to get her second marriage annulled, although I actually question whether she maybe made up the first sort of clandestine marriage because she fancied someone else.
Well, and this is a classic case of the documentation becoming fuller and better the further we go through time. So once you get into the 14th century and beyond, you're getting more and more documentation, better survival. Departmental, officers are subdividing and bureaucracy's going mad. You've got lots of records, duplicates, triplicates of things, so lots more survive. There's less time for it to. So yeah, 30 after I tend to stop. Well, to 1280s really, but after that. But yeah, no, it is really interesting. And the interesting thing too is that if you have not been shown to be legally married, you can't have dower. So there's an argument that I've seen in during the course of my PhD, I remember it, where someone said, she doesn't have a right to have dower, she was never married to my father or whatever, she was just his mistress. And she said, I was married to him. So there's this argument going on in court.
Okay, right. One quick question, please, Kathy, and one quick answer.
Okay.
Sorry, this is really an answer to your question.
Okay.
The sister of Edward IV, Anne of Exeter, she sought an annulment and was annulled from her first marriage to Henry Holland of Exeter because he was violent. He was excessively violent.
Yeah.
But I think probably her big ace card was that her brother was the king. She got the annulment, and when he died, she actually inherited his property, which I think is quite unusual.
Yeah, and I think if you, the king, you see the king interfering in a lot of things. I mean, I've got a Jewish case where the Jewish husband wants to divorce his wife, there's no children, and marry another woman. They're money-lending society, and he goes to the king, and she goes off to Paris to the Beth Din, and the king has his way, the King of England has his way. He says, hey, the Jewish authorities can't interfere in my area, my country, or whatever. Yeah.
Right, it's now time for us to move on.